For decades, Taiwan wasn't a bargaining chip. It was a tripwire, and in the quiet shift from one to the other lies the most dangerous miscalculation of the modern era. Here's the real reason Washington's China policy is starting to look less like strategy and more like a series of open-ended negotiations. American foreign policy has gone transactional, not just on trade, not just on tariffs, on deterrence itself. That's the warning at the heart of a recent piece in The Hill, arguing that Washington's hyper-transactional turn is quietly unraveling decades of American deterrence in Asia, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. For more than 40 years, the architecture holding the Pacific together wasn't built on deals. It was built on ambiguity, strategic ambiguity, the deliberate refusal to spell out exactly what the United States would or would not do if Beijing moved on Taiwan. That ambiguity was the entire point. It made the cost of invasion impossible to calculate, and when you can't calculate the cost, you don't roll the dice. Layered on top of that ambiguity was something even more important. Consistency. Allies in Tokyo, Seoul, Manila, and Canberra didn't need a written guarantee for every contingency. They needed to know the American posture didn't change with the news cycle. They needed to believe that the commitment behind the carriers and the basing agreements and the arms sales was structural, not situational. That belief is what the article calls strategic architecture, and it's that architecture, not any single weapon system, that has kept the peace across the Taiwan Strait for generations. Now consider what happens when that architecture is replaced with something else, when every commitment becomes a negotiation, when every alliance is reframed as a balance sheet, when the question stops being what does America stand for and becomes what is America willing to trade. The shift sounds tough. It sounds like savvy deal making. It sounds like finally getting allies to pay their share. But to a strategist in Beijing, it sounds like something very different. It sounds like a door cracking open. Because the moment Taiwan becomes a flexible variable in the US-China rivalry, the moment its security is something that can be traded against tariffs or chips or fentanyl cooperation, or a summit photo op, the entire calculation changes. Taiwan stops being the line. It becomes the lever, and that's the peril at the center of this argument. Transactional deterrence isn't deterrence at all. It's an invitation to test the price. Think about how deterrence actually works. It isn't about military hardware and isolation, it's about belief. The other side has to believe that the cost of acting will be higher than the cost of waiting. The moment they suspect the cost is negotiable, waiting becomes the riskier option. Because if the price is going down, you move now before it drops further. That is the timeline shift the article points to. Not a shift driven by Beijing's ambitions, which have been clear for years. A shift driven unwittingly by Washington itself, by the signal, repeated in deal after deal, that everything is on the table. Look at the pattern from Beijing's vantage point. An American administration that publicly questions the value of long-standing alliances, that treats security guarantees as line items, that frames foreign policy victories as wins extracted from partners as much as adversaries. The message received is not the message intended. The message received is that American commitments have a price tag, and price tags can be haggled. Once that idea takes root, deterrence starts to corrode from the inside, not with a dramatic withdrawal, not with a formal abandonment, with a slow drift where allies start hedging, adversaries start probing, and the gray zone between peace and war gets wider every year. You can already see the hedging. Japan accelerating its own defense buildup at a pace not seen since the post-war era. South Korea openly debating nuclear options that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The Philippines deepening basing arrangements one month and recalibrating the next. Australia binding itself to AUKUS while quietly asking what happens if Washington's mood changes again. None of these countries are panicking. They're doing something more telling. They're ensuring. They're building options for a world where the American commitment can no longer be assumed as a constant. That is what the erosion of strategic architecture actually looks like in real time, not collapse. Adjustment. Quiet, expensive, and irreversible adjustment. Now layer Taiwan on top of that. Taiwan is not just another ally. It is the keystone. It sits at the geographic and symbolic center of the first island chain. It produces the advanced semiconductors that run the global economy, and it stands as the living proof that a Chinese-speaking democracy can exist and thrive. Every part of that matters to Beijing, and every part of that has made Taiwan, until recently, untouchable in practical terms. What changes when Taiwan becomes transactional? Everything downstream changes, because if Taiwan can be discussed as a variable, every other commitment becomes negotiable too. The defense of the Senkakus, the patrols in the South China Sea, the nuclear umbrella over Seoul. Once the keystone is loose, the arch doesn't fall all at once. but it stops holding weight. And here's the part that doesn't get enough attention. The shift the article describes wasn't necessarily intended to weaken deterrence. That's what makes it perilous. It's a side effect, a byproduct of a worldview that sees foreign policy primarily as a series of bilateral deals. When you optimize for the deal, you stop optimizing for the architecture, and the architecture is what kept the peace. There's a hard truth buried in this. Deterrence is expensive precisely because it must be unconditional. The minute you make it conditional, you've already paid a different and larger price. You've paid in credibility, and credibility, once spent, doesn't come back through a press release. History has examples of this. The signal sent before the Korean War, when Secretary of State Dean Acheson sketched a defensive perimeter that appeared to leave South Korea outside it. The ambiguity around Kuwait in the summer of 1990. The patterns are not identical, but the lesson is. When adversaries believe a commitment is soft, they probe. When they probe and the response is muddled, they push. When they push and the response is delayed, they take. The article's central concern is that the United States is generating exactly this kind of signal toward Taiwan, not through any single statement, through the cumulative effect of a transactional posture that treats nothing as sacred and everything as priced. And the timeline matters enormously here. For years, analysts have debated when Beijing might feel ready to act on Taiwan. Some pointed to 2027. Some pointed further out. The honest answer was always that the decision would depend less on military readiness and more on political calculation, on whether the cost of acting still felt prohibitive. That calculation is now in motion. Not because of anything Taiwan did, not because of any sudden weakness in American hardware, because of a posture change in Washington that quietly rewrites the math. This is what the phrase unwittingly shifted Taiwan's timeline means. The United States may have, without intending to, moved the needle on when Beijing believes a move on Taiwan becomes thinkable, not inevitable, thinkable. And in deterrence, the gap between unthinkable and thinkable is the only gap that matters. So what does the alternative look like? It's not louder rhetoric. It's not more red lines drawn in public. The architecture that worked for decades was quiet. It worked because it was predictable, because allies and adversaries alike understood that American commitments were not subject to renegotiation every news cycle. Restoring that doesn't require a new doctrine. It requires the discipline to stop treating every relationship as a transaction. It requires recognizing that some commitments derive their power precisely from being non-negotiable, that the value of the alliance system is not the sum of its individual deals. It is the confidence it generates that the system itself will hold. There's a reason serious strategists talk about credibility as a finite resource. You build it slowly, you spend it quickly, and once spent, you rebuild it at enormous cost, if at all. Every signal that a commitment is conditional is a small withdrawal from the account. Most of those withdrawals never make headlines. They show up later in the form of allies hedging and adversaries probing, and crises arriving sooner than anyone expected. This is the cost the article is trying to put a price on, not the cost of any single deal. The cost of a framework that has stopped distinguishing between deals and architecture. The uncomfortable question underneath all of this is whether the shift can be reversed. Architectures take generations to build. They can be damaged in years. The damage doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the quiet decisions of partners deciding that self-reliance is now their primary insurance policy. It shows up in the boardrooms of companies hedging their supply chains away from the strait. It shows up in the war games that adversaries run, where the assumption of unconditional American response is replaced with a probability distribution. None of this means war is coming tomorrow. It means the conditions that made war unthinkable are eroding, and erosion is harder to see than collapse. The peril of transactional deterrence is not that any single deal goes badly. It's that the framing itself, the idea that everything is a deal, corrodes the one thing deterrence cannot survive without. The belief on every side that some commitments are not for sale. That belief is what held the Taiwan Strait quiet for nearly half a century. It is what convinced Beijing that patience was the better play. It is what allowed a small island democracy to flourish under the shadow of a giant. If that belief weakens, nothing else in the region works the way it used to. The carriers still sail. The treaties still exist, the arms sales still happen, but the music underneath them changes, and in geopolitics, the music is everything. The real lesson sitting inside this argument is simple. Deterrence is a story before it is a strategy. It is the story allies tell themselves about who will show up. It is the story adversaries tell themselves about who will not back down. When the story changes, the world changes with it. Long before any shots are fired, Washington may believe it is driving harder bargains. Beijing may be hearing something else entirely. And in that gap between what is said and what is heard, timelines are quietly moving. The most dangerous moments in history are rarely the ones that arrive with sirens. They are the ones that arrive after years of small recalculations, when one side decides the cost has finally dropped low enough to act. Strategic architecture exists to keep that cost permanently out of reach. Trade the architecture for the deal, and you don't just lose the architecture. You lose the only thing standing between deterrence and discovery. And the thing about discovery in the Taiwan Strait is that no one gets to take it back.